Every time you apologize unnecessarily, you make yourself easier to control, not because the person receiving it is calculating that consciously, because of what the apology signals about your relationship to your own position, about whether you believe what you did required defending, or whether the discomfort of someone else's response was enough to make you retreat from it. Our Machiavelli identified the unnecessary apology as one of the most consistent mechanisms through which capable people systematically weaken their own strategic position, one interaction at a time. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly what each apology is actually communicating and what to do instead that protects your position without making you someone who never takes accountability. Gently, let's start with what an unnecessary apology actually is, because the line between accountability and strategic retreat is more specific than most people realize. This is not an argument against accountability. This is not an argument against accountability. Size. When you have genuinely caused damage, when your action or decision has produced a real cost for someone who did not deserve to absorb it, acknowledging that clearly, without deflection, is not weakness. It is the most sophisticated form of strategic integrity available. It builds the kind of alliance credibility that is almost impossible to manufacture any other way. That is not what we are talking about. We are talking about the other category, the apology that arrives not in response to genuine damage, but in response to discomfort, someone else's displeasure, their raised voice, or their silence, or their expression of disappointment, the social pressure of a moment that felt uncomfortable enough that retreating from your own position seemed like the fastest way to restore equilibrium. Machiavelli identified these two categories with surgical precision. True, quote, common, he wrote that the prince who acknowledges genuine error demonstrates strength because the acknowledgement is accurate and costs them something real. But the prince who apologizes for his position, who retreats from a correct decision because the people affected by it express displeasure, has communicated something far more damaging than whatever the original decision was. He has communicated that his position is negotiable, that displeasure is sufficient leverage, that the pressure of someone else's discomfort is enough to move him from a place he had calculated as correct. And once that is communicated, once the room understands that displeasure moves you, the displeasure becomes a toll, not always consciously, but reliably. The second thing is more uncomfortable because it requires looking at not just what the apology signals to others, but what it does to your own relationship with your decisions. Here is the internal cost that nobody talks about. Every time you apologize for a position you had calculated as correct, every time you retreat from a decision because the response to it produced social discomfort, you are not just managing the external dynamic. You are teaching yourself something. You are teaching yourself that your calculations are provisional, that they are subject to revision, not by new information or better reasoning, but by the emotional register of whoever is responding to them, that the discomfort of someone else's displeasure is sufficient evidence that you were wrong. Machiavelli watched this erode the decision-making capacity of leaders across his entire career, not through single catastrophic failures, through the accumulation of small retreats, each one individually defensible, even reasonable seeming, but collectively producing a decision-maker who had lost confidence in their own calculations because they had revised them too many times in response to pressure rather than evidence. The person who apologizes unnecessarily is not just managing the current interaction. They are training their own strategic intelligence to defer to social pressure over accurate observation. And that training, applied consistently over time, produces a version of you that cannot hold a position under pressure, even when holding it is clearly correct. And that the unnecessary apology does not just cost you the moment, it costs you the clarity of the next decision, and the one after that. The third layer is where this stops being about power and starts being about something more personal. Why? Because the pattern of unnecessary apology almost always originates somewhere specific, and understanding where it comes from is what makes it possible to actually change. Most people who over-apologize are not doing it from weakness. Dalton Hale They are doing it from a learned operational pattern, one that developed in an environment where conflict was costly, where someone else's displeasure carried real consequences, where the fastest and most reliable way to restore safety was to absorb the responsibility for the discomfort and signal surrender. In that environment, that original environment, the apology was not a retreat. It was an intelligent adaptation, a way of managing a dynamic where the alternative to apologizing was more dangerous than apologizing. The problem is that the adaptation does not update when the environment changes. You carry the pattern into environments where the original conditions no longer apply, where displeasure does not carry the same cost, where the person expressing it does not have the same leverage, and where holding your position would actually produce better outcomes for the dynamic, for your standing within it, for your own strategic stability. Machiavelli was precise about this. The strategic pattern that protected you in one environment will destroy your position in another if you do not recalibrate it to the actual conditions you are currently operating in. So, look at that. 1. The over-apology is not a character flaw. It is an outdated adaptation being applied to a situation it was never designed for. Recognizing that, clearly, without judgment of yourself for having developed it, is the beginning of the recalibration. The replacement is not silence, not aggression, not the performance of someone who never acknowledges anything. It is a specific discipline, applied at a specific moment, the moment when the social pressure to apologize arrives and you feel the pull to retreat before you have assessed whether retreat is actually warranted. The pages. Pause before the apology, not visibly, internally. One full breath between the pressure arriving and your response to it. Long enough to ask one question. Am I apologizing because I caused genuine damage or because someone is uncomfortable with my position? If the answer is genuine damage, acknowledge it directly, specifically, without deflection. Not "I'm sorry you felt that way." The actual acknowledgement of the actual cost. That version of accountability costs you nothing strategically and builds more alliance credibility than almost any other move available. Blessing. If the answer is discomfort with your position, do not apologize for the position. Acknowledge the discomfort instead. I understand this is difficult, or I hear that this is not what you needed. These are not apologies. They are observations. They demonstrate that you have registered the other person's experience without surrendering the accuracy of your own assessment. Machiavelli called this the posture of the positioned decision maker. Not cold, not indifferent to the impact of decisions on the people affected by them, but clear about the difference between genuine accountability and strategic retreat, and disciplined enough to hold that distinction under social pressure. Why? Let's say. That distinction is not something you develop overnight, but it begins with the pause, one breath, one question, and the discipline to answer it honestly before you speak. 4 things, one shift underneath all of them. There are 2 kinds of apology. One builds credibility, one surrenders position. Every unnecessary apology teaches your own strategic intelligence to defer to social pressure over accurate observation. The pattern almost always originates in an adapted response to an earlier environment where displeasure carried real cost, and the replacement is not silence, but the precise discipline of distinguishing genuine accountability from strategic retreat, and holding that distinction under pressure. Machiavelli never apologized for his assessments. He told me that even the ones that cost him, even the ones that contributed to his exile, he acknowledged consequences clearly, without deflection, but he did not retreat from the accuracy of his observation because the people affected by it were displeased. And 5 centuries later, the assessments that cost him everything are the ones the world considers most accurate. Your position, the one you keep apologizing for, deserves the same discipline. And think about the last unnecessary apology you gave, the moment you retreated from a position you had calculated as correct, not because new information arrived, not because you recognized genuine damage, but because someone's displeasure was uncomfortable enough that making it stop felt more important than holding the ground. What did that apology actually cost you? What did that apology actually cost? Not just in that moment, in what it taught you about your own positions, in what it communicated to the person receiving it, about what moves you. In the small, incremental erosion of your confidence in your own calculations that accumulates across every unnecessary retreat, you are allowed to hold your position. You are allowed to acknowledge someone's discomfort without making their discomfort evidence that you were wrong. You are allowed to be someone who takes genuine accountability seriously, precisely because you do not dilute it with apologies for things that did not require one. That is not coldness. That is finally treating your own assessments with the same seriousness you ask other people to treat them with. One question. The Franklin Whisper. What position have you been apologizing for that you actually calculated correctly? And what has the repeated retreat from it cost your standing in that dynamic? Sit with that. The honest answer, the useful one. Warm, drop, positioned in the comments. If this gave you something to carry into the next moment, you feel the pull to retreat. I will be reading every one. Take care of yourself.